Do you remember those funny things from the 80s? The ones so outrageous they would shock people today? These fads and habits filled our bedrooms, schools, and weekends, shaping daily life in ways we barely questioned back then. Looking back now, do we laugh at the absurdity or wonder how normal it all felt? Garbage pail. Kids' trading cards were one of the strangest and funniest playground crazes of the 1980s. They were created as gross-out parodies of the wildly popular Cabbage Patch Kids dolls, and the artwork leaned into every disgusting detail you can imagine. Each card featured a bizarre character with names like Snotty Scotty or Barfin' Barbara, complete with exaggerated cartoons of slime, snot, or exploding heads. Kids could not get enough of them, stuffing shoeboxes and binders full of their collections. Parents and teachers, however, were horrified, often banning them from schools for being too crude. That only made them more desirable. Suddenly, every kid wanted to trade the ones that were too gross for polite company. Entire recess periods turned into negotiations, with kids swapping duplicates and bragging about the rarest finds. The cards became a social currency, something that could instantly elevate your status if you owned a particularly shocking design. Looking back today, it is hilarious to think that children walked around with pictures of vomiting dolls as prized possessions. At the time, though, Garbage Pail Kids captured the exact mix of rebellion and humor that made childhood in the 1980s unforgettable. Boom boxes on shoulders turned sidewalks into concert stages in the 1980s. These massive stereos were heavy, bulky, and required a mountain of batteries, but carrying one on your shoulder was a badge of honor. Teens strutted through neighborhoods blasting the latest hits, turning heads and sometimes drawing complaints from adults. The sound was loud and unmissable, filling entire city blocks with bass and treble, whether you liked it or not. For many kids, the boombox was more than music. It was identity, culture, and confidence rolled into one. They became symbols of hip-hop, breakdancing, and street culture, with crews practicing routines on sidewalks while the music thundered from a speaker perched precariously on someone's shoulder. Parents saw them as noise machines, while kids saw them as freedom itself. Looking back, it is funny to imagine teenagers lugging around 30 pounds of plastic and electronics just to play a cassette tape, but that was exactly the point. The boombox was over the top, and in the 1980s, that was cool. Big hair with entire bottles of hairspray defined the 1980s look, and it was as impractical as it was unforgettable. Women and men alike teased, sprayed, and layered their hair into towering shapes that seemed to defy gravity. The bigger, the better was the motto, and the haze of aerosol hung in bedrooms and bathrooms like morning mist. Entire cans of hairspray disappeared in a single weekend, and the resulting styles were so stiff they could survive wind, rain, and sometimes even a nap. Teenagers spent hours in front of mirrors perfecting their wings or bang walls, turning school hallways into fashion runways. Rock bands added to the trend, with hair metal groups flaunting wild manes that looked more sculpted than natural. Parents chuckled, warning their kids that one spark could turn their heads into torches. Today it seems absurd to use so much flammable spray for the sake of fashion, but in the 1980s it was essential. The smell of hairspray and the memory of hair teased sky high remain some of the funniest symbols of the decade. Talking Teddy Ruxpin dolls were the high-tech toys that managed to be both magical and unsettling. This cuddly bear had a cassette player in its back, and when you inserted a tape, its eyes and mouth moved as it read stories out loud. Kids were amazed, crowding around Teddy as if he were alive, hanging on every word of his adventures. Parents bought them as educational tools, believing the interactive reading experience would help kids learn. But there was something undeniably creepy about a stuffed animal that blinked and talked with a mechanical voice. For some children, Teddy was a beloved bedtime companion, while for others he was a nightmare waiting to happen. Malfunctions made it even funnier in hindsight. Sometimes Teddy's batteries would die mid-sentence, leaving him with a slow, haunting drawl. Despite the quirks, Teddy Ruxpin became a must-have toy, showing just how far the 1980s would go to make technology part of childhood. Today, looking back at that animatronic bear, it is hard not to laugh at how seriously we took him. Waterbeds turned bedrooms into sloshing playgrounds. The fad swept through the 1980s with promises of better sleep, luxury, and of course, romance. In reality, they were heavy, messy, and prone to leaks. Moving one required draining gallons of water, and if the vinyl ripped, you were left with a miniature flood. Friends would come over just to bounce around on them, daring each other to jump hard enough to make a wave across the mattress. Couples bragged about owning one as if it were a luxury car parked in their bedroom. Even though they were impractical, the sheer novelty made waterbeds feel futuristic, like sleeping on a science experiment. Still, people loved them, bragging about their modern beds as if they were cutting-edge technology. Kids bounced on them until they nearly burst, and parents sometimes woke up seasick from the constant rolling motion. Ads made them seem glamorous, with couples lounging on beds that looked like indoor pools. In truth, they were impractical and hilarious in hindsight, but they became icons of the decade nonetheless. Waterbeds were proof that in the 1980s, style mattered more than sense, and people were willing to put up with waves in their sleep just to feel trendy. Swatch watch stacking was one of the quirkiest fashion choices of the 1980s. Instead of wearing just one colorful plastic watch, teens began wearing several at once, stacked up and down their arms like bracelets. The more you wore, the cooler you looked, or at least that was the idea. Swatch watches came in neon colors, bold patterns, and wild designs that made every wrist look like a carnival. Some kids had entire collections, swapping out watches to match their outfits like jewelry. Stores cashed in on the craze, with displays that looked more like candy shops than watch counters. Having multiple swatches on your wrist was less about telling time and more about shouting, "Look at me." Collecting them became an obsession, and entire outfits were built around which swatches you chose to wear. Adults scratched their heads wondering why anyone needed 4 watches to tell the same time. The truth was, it was not about practicality at all. It was about standing out. Today, the idea of layering watches seems silly, but in the 1980s, it was peak style. Swatch stacking turned telling time into a fashion statement, one that now feels funny but perfectly captures the playful excess of the decade. Scratch and sniff stickers were a schoolyard sensation that seems absurd now, but was completely normal in the 1980s. Teachers handed them out as rewards, and kids eagerly pressed them to their noses to catch scents of pizza, popcorn, bubblegum, or even gasoline. Collectors filled albums with pages of stickers, trading duplicates like baseball cards. Some smelled sweet, others strange, and the fun was in discovering which was which. Sticker clubs popped up, where kids swapped their rarest scents like secret treasures. Some stickers smelled so weird, like rubber tires or skunk, that they became jokes everyone wanted to try. Entire afternoons were spent flipping through albums, each page a gallery of scents and colors. Parents laughed at the idea of children obsessing over smelly pieces of paper, but the craze was unstoppable. Stickers with bizarre scents became the most sought after, making kids feel like they owned treasures. Looking back, it is funny to realize how many children spent hours huffing scratch and sniff paper, but at the time, it was one of the highlights of childhood. Trapper keepers with loud designs were the school accessory every kid wanted. These binders came with wild patterns, bright colors, and Velcro flaps that snapped shut with a satisfying rip. They held folders, notebooks, and secret notes passed in class, and having one instantly made you cool. Kids compared designs, traded, and bragged about whose Trapper Keeper had the flashiest cover. Opening one in class made a sound that every kid recognized instantly, and sometimes that Velcro rip was louder than the teacher's voice. Some Trapper Keepers had covers so wild, neon shapes, lightning bolts, or space scenes, that they felt more like toys than school supplies. Collecting them was a point of pride, and kids treated their binders like prized possessions. Parents grumbled about the price, but gave in because they knew how badly their kids wanted one. Teachers sometimes banned them for being too distracting, especially when students opened and closed the Velcro over and over. Looking back, it is hilarious how much status was tied to a simple binder, but that was the magic of the 1980s. The Trapper Keeper was not just school supplies, it was identity. MTV music video marathons turned watching television into an all-day event. Teens and young adults sat glued to the screen, watching hours of non-stop music videos like they were live performances. Artists became legends thanks to constant rotation, and kids memorized entire videos frame by frame. Parents shook their heads, wondering how anyone could sit in front of the television for that long. But the music video boom was unstoppable. Some kids recorded their favorite videos on VHS and re-watched them until the tapes wore out. Entire friend groups debated which videos were the coolest, and some kids even choreographed dances to copy what they saw on screen. Staying up late for a world premiere was like watching history happen, and no one wanted to miss it. Some people even recorded hours of MTV onto VHS tapes so they could re-watch their favorite videos whenever they wanted. Looking back today, it seems funny how serious everyone was about watching videos on repeat, but it was the cultural heartbeat of the decade. MTV made television feel cool, and music became as visual as it was auditory. Pogo ball toys were one of those 1980s inventions that sounded fun but almost always ended in falls. The toy was a rubber ball squeezed inside a plastic ring, and kids stood on the ring while trying to bounce around like human pogo sticks. In theory, it was exercise and entertainment. In practice, it was scraped knees and bruised elbows. Parents bought them because they were cheap and trendy, but kids quickly realized they were almost impossible to master. Neighborhood competitions sprang up, with kids daring each other to see who could bounce the longest without falling. Some kids swore by tricks that usually ended in wipeouts, while others just turned them into races across driveways. The laughter and crashes became part of the fun, even if band-aids were always required afterward. Neighborhood sidewalks and driveways became arenas for kids to test their balance, often with hilarious results. Looking back, it is surprising how many children willingly hopped onto unstable toys that practically guaranteed wipeouts. The pogo ball was funny, clumsy, and perfectly 1980s, an example of how even the strangest ideas could become national crazes. Mixtapes for every emotion were the love letters and diaries of the 1980s, painstakingly crafted one song at a time. With nothing but a blank cassette and hours of patience, teens sat by their radios waiting for just the right track to come on. The record button was always ready, though it was almost impossible to avoid the DJ talking over the intro or outro. Still, each mixtape was a masterpiece of effort, whether it was for a crush, a best friend, or just the soundtrack to your own moody afternoon. People poured their hearts into arranging songs in the perfect order, hoping the listener would notice the thought behind each track. Kids traded them, couples bonded over them, and sometimes friendships ended because someone reused a tape that was too important. Parents were baffled by the obsession, but for teenagers, it was the truest form of communication. Today, it is funny to think about how much energy went into pressing buttons on a tape deck, but at the time, mixtapes carried weight. They were proof that music could say what words could not, and they remain one of the most unforgettable relics of 1980s youth culture. Novelty phones turned every phone call into a comedy skit. Instead of plain beige or black telephones, the 1980s offered designs shaped like giant red lips, cartoon characters like Garfield, or even sports equipment. Kids begged their parents for them, and families proudly displayed them as if they were art pieces. Picking up a Garfield phone meant the sleepy cat lifted the receiver from his back, while the lips looked like they were whispering secrets whenever you made a call. The sound quality was terrible, the size was clunky, and cords tangled constantly. But none of that mattered. Friends giggled when they saw them, and answering the phone became a small performance. Parents might have rolled their eyes, but they often caved in because these phones made their kids so happy. Looking back now, it feels absurd that people paid extra money for a phone that looked like a cartoon, but it was exactly the kind of playful extravagance that defined the decade. They remind us that in the 1980s, even the most ordinary objects were expected to be bold, colorful, and funny. Roller rinks with carpet walls were the weekend playgrounds for teenagers. Every Friday and Saturday night, kids laced up their skates and glided in circles under disco balls and neon lights. The walls were covered in garish, patterned carpet, supposedly for safety but mostly as decoration, and kids often grabbed onto them when they lost balance. The carpet collected years of sweat and soda spills, but no one cared. Music pounded from giant speakers, couples held hands as they skated, and groups of friends formed long chains, inevitably ending in pileups on the floor. Falling was part of the fun, and hugging those carpeted walls became a rite of passage. Parents dropped kids off and picked them up hours later, knowing the rink was both safe and social. Today, the idea of skating in circles while clinging to dirty carpet walls might sound strange, but in the 1980s, it was the height of cool. Roller rinks gave teens freedom, community, and a place to laugh at themselves, and the carpet walls made sure everyone had a little extra grip when things got wobbly. Novelty lunchboxes with thermoses were not just containers for food. They were badges of identity in the school cafeteria. Kids strutted into class with boxes plastered with images of their favorite cartoons, movies, or celebrities. From Star Wars to He-Man to Strawberry Shortcake, lunchboxes told the world exactly what you loved. Inside, the matching thermos carried warm soup, milk, or juice, often leaking a little by the end of the day. Parents bought them for practicality, but kids treasured them as much as toys. Opening one at lunchtime felt like showing off a prized possession, and kids compared designs just as seriously as they traded stickers or cards. The paint chipped, the metal dented, and the plastic cracked over time, but they still felt magical. Today they might look silly, but in the 1980s, a lunchbox was as much a statement as a fashion accessory. For kids, it was the one school supply that blended necessity with pure fun, and looking back, it is hilarious how much power those little boxes held over playground status. Koosh Balls were simple, silly toys that somehow became a sensation. Made of hundreds of rubber strings bundled together, they were colorful, squishy, and weirdly satisfying to hold. Kids bounced them, tossed them, and squeezed them, often turning them into indoor dodgeballs despite parents' warnings. Teachers confiscated them from classrooms, where kids absent-mindedly flung them across the room or fiddled with them during lessons. The texture was half the appeal, soft enough to play with indoors, but heavy enough to sting a little when they smacked someone. Kids invented endless games with them, from target practice to juggling, and some people swore they were great stress relievers. Parents rolled their eyes at paying good money for what looked like a bundle of rubber bands, but the fad swept across schools anyway. Looking back, it seems funny that something so simple could cause such a frenzy. But that was the magic of the 1980s. Sometimes the strangest little toys became the biggest hits. Friendship pins on shoes were tiny but mighty tokens of 1980s schoolyard culture. These were ordinary safety pins decorated with colorful beads, carefully arranged into patterns or initials. Kids gave them to their closest friends, who proudly pinned them onto their shoelaces. The act of giving one felt almost ceremonial, like a miniature friendship bracelet that could travel with you wherever you went. Trading them during recess became an unspoken ritual, complete with negotiations and promises of loyalty. Entire cliques sometimes coordinated their pin colors, turning sneakers into matching badges of identity. The more pins you had, the more popular you looked, and kids compared collections like trophies. Making them was a hobby, with hours spent stringing beads and planning the perfect designs. Parents loved them because they were cheap and kept kids busy, while kids adored them for the social currency they carried. Teachers sometimes banned them when trading became too distracting, but that only made them more desirable. Today, the idea of decorating sneakers with beaded pins seems almost absurd, but in the 1980s it was a sign of belonging. Friendship pins turned safety pins into powerful symbols of loyalty, making every pair of sneakers into walking scrapbooks of childhood connections. The Rubik's Cube craze was a global obsession that swept through classrooms and living rooms alike. Every kid seemed to own one, twisting and turning the brightly colored cube in frustration. Very few ever solved it honestly. Many resorted to peeling off the stickers or popping out the pieces to win. Entire playground debates broke out about who was the fastest solver, even if most kids could barely line up 2 rows. Some families proudly displayed solved cubes in living rooms, even though everyone knew it had been solved with a screwdriver. Kids often carried them around like trophies, proof they were at least brave enough to try. Competitions sprung up to see who could solve it fastest, and kids bragged if they managed even one side. Parents encouraged it as a brain teaser, but to most children, it was more a toy to show off than a puzzle to conquer. Friends passed them around on school buses, daring each other to solve just a few more rows. Looking back, it is funny to think about the number of cubes abandoned half-solved on shelves, mocking their owners. Still, the Rubik's Cube became a cultural icon, representing both the challenge and the humor of trying, and usually failing, to solve it. Fashion sunglasses at night were one of the strangest style choices of the 1980s. Big tinted glasses with colored lenses were worn indoors, at parties, and yes, even after the sun went down. Celebrities and music videos fueled the craze, and teens copied the look in malls and at school dances. Wearing them was less about vision and more about attitude, a way to project mystery and coolness. Friends teased each other for bumping into things, but no one dared admit how impractical the look was. Photos from the time show entire groups at dances or concerts squinting through dark lenses, convinced they were fashion icons. Parents could not understand why anyone would wear sunglasses when they clearly could not see, but that was part of the rebellion. The glasses were bold, oversized, and made wearers feel like rock stars, even if they were just standing in line for pizza. Today, the idea of stumbling around in the dark with tinted shades is laughable, but in the 1980s, it was a serious fashion move. Looking back, it is one of the funniest examples of how far the decade went to look cool, even at the expense of practicality. Glow-in-the-dark stars on bedroom ceilings were the nighttime dreamscape of 1980s kids. These little plastic stars stuck to walls and ceilings, soaking up light during the day so they could glow faintly at night. Kids begged for them, imagining they were sleeping under a personal galaxy. Friends who had entire ceilings covered were envied, and sleepovers under those glowing constellations felt magical. Some kids painstakingly tried to copy real star patterns, while others just threw them everywhere for maximum glow. Parents laughed when they peeled off years later, leaving sticky marks that no amount of scrubbing could erase. Parents saw them as an easy and cheap way to decorate a room, while kids treasured them as magic. Falling asleep under those glowing dots felt comforting, even if they eventually peeled off and stuck to socks or hair. Some kids tried to create constellations, while others just covered every inch of their ceiling. Today, the faint glow of plastic stars seems funny compared to modern gadgets, but back then, they were enchanting. They turned bedrooms into personal planetariums, making kids feel like they had the universe just above their beds. Home aerobics on VHS tapes were both inspiring and hilarious. Parents popped tapes into the VCR, pulled on neon leotards, leg warmers, and sweatbands, and followed along to instructors shouting encouragement. Jane Fonda's workouts became legendary, but there were countless imitators, each promising to tone bodies from the comfort of the living room. The living room often turned into a makeshift gym, with kids dodging coffee tables while parents did lunges. Some families even invested in small dumbbells or steps just to keep up with what they saw on screen. Dogs and cats often wandered into the workout space, adding unexpected comedy to the routine. Kids often peeked around corners, giggling at their parents jumping, lunging, and sweating to upbeat music. The exercises were tough, the outfits were loud, and the results were mixed, but the fad swept across the country. Families moved coffee tables to make room, and some even bought step platforms or hand weights to match what they saw on screen. Looking back, it is funny to remember how seriously people took those grainy VHS workouts, but they captured the energy of the decade perfectly. Home aerobics were as much about looking the part as feeling the burn, and they remain one of the funniest, most nostalgic fads of the 1980s. Arcade token collecting was one of the funniest yet most serious currencies of the 1980s. Every mall arcade or Chuck E. Cheese had its own branded tokens, and kids treated them like they were gold. Parents gave out a few quarters or bills for the token machine, and suddenly children were clutching handfuls of shiny discs that might as well have been real money. Some kids saved them, stashing them in jars or shoeboxes, showing them off to friends like they were rare coins. Others planned entire afternoons around spending them, carefully rationing out which games deserved a token and which were not worth the risk of losing. Popular cabinets like Pac-Man or Donkey Kong gobbled up tokens at a furious pace, while skee-ball or ticket machines promised prizes that looked amazing on the wall but were usually just plastic junk. The tokens rattled in pockets, spilled on the sticky arcade carpet, and were sometimes even stolen by siblings. Looking back, it is hilarious to think of kids hoarding hundreds of tokens that had no value outside of one specific building. But at the time, they were treasure. Proof that you could play one more game or win one more handful of tickets. Parents rolled their eyes, but they knew those tokens represented pure joy. Today, the idea of collecting tokens like real money seems silly, but in the 1980s it was serious business. Kids literally measured fun by how many little coins they had in their hands. TV dinners in foil trays were the future of food. At least, that is what the ads promised in the 1980s. Families bought stacks of them at the grocery store, excited to have a complete meal ready in just a few minutes. The trays were divided into neat little compartments: meatloaf or fried chicken in one section, mashed potatoes in another, and maybe a brownie tucked into the corner. The idea seemed brilliant, but the execution was hilarious. Microwaves cooked them unevenly, so the potatoes were frozen in the middle while the edges of the brownie turned to lava. Parents warned kids to be careful with the foil trays, which sparked and hissed if microwaved too long. Still, kids loved the novelty of having their own meal in a personal tray, no sharing required. The food often looked nothing like the pictures on the box, but the convenience made people overlook the taste. Dinner tables glowed with the reflection of aluminum, families poking at half-burned, half-icy entrees while watching sitcoms in the background. Today, it is funny to remember how proudly people served these meals, treating them like culinary breakthroughs. In hindsight, they were more comedy than cuisine, but in the 1980s, they represented the promise of modern life. Faster, easier, and just a little bit ridiculous. Designer jeans obsession swept through schools in the 1980s, turning clothing labels into status symbols. Suddenly, brands like Jordache, Guess, and Calvin Klein were not just jeans, they were proof of coolness. Kids begged parents for pairs with logos stitched on the back pocket, and wearing the wrong brand could mean instant embarrassment. Entire hallways turned into runways, with teens strutting their labels as if they were in a fashion show. Parents complained about the prices, but kids insisted they had to have them to fit in. The ads added fuel to the fire, with commercials turning denim into something glamorous and almost rebellious. Jeans that had once been practical work clothes now became luxury items, with tight fits, stone washes, and designer tags. Kids compared who had the newest pair, and fights broke out over whose jeans were real and whose were knockoffs. Looking back, it is hilarious to think kids judged each other so harshly over stitching and logos. But that was the culture of the time. Parents often caved, buying expensive jeans just to keep the peace, even though the quality was not much different from cheaper brands. Today, the obsession seems absurd, but in the 1980s, designer jeans were a ticket to popularity, and nothing could feel more important to a teenager. Mall walking for fun was a fad that might sound like a joke now, but in the 1980s it was treated as exercise. Groups of adults, mostly retirees or stay-at-home parents, gathered in shopping malls before stores opened to walk the long corridors. The climate-controlled environment meant no rain, no heat, and no excuses. People strolled past window displays, chatting with friends and counting laps as if they were at a track meet. Some took it very seriously, wearing sweatbands and sneakers, while others treated it as a social outing with coffee afterward. Malls even embraced the trend, opening their doors early and sometimes providing maps for mile markers. Kids found it funny to watch, especially when their parents strutted past mannequins in neon workout gear. For adults, though, it was practical and convenient. Exercise blended with socializing in a safe public place. Looking back, it is hilarious to picture groups of people marching through food courts before anyone was buying pizza or ice cream. But at the time, mall walking was seen as innovative, a way to turn suburban sprawl into fitness. Today, the idea of meeting at a mall just to walk in circles sounds silly, but in the 1980s it was considered a genuine health craze. Silly slap bracelets were one of the quickest and funniest fads to sweep through 1980s schools. The concept was simple: a thin strip of metal covered in colorful fabric that snapped around your wrist when you slapped it against your arm. Kids went wild for them, trading designs, stacking multiples on their arms, and snapping them on friends just for laughs. Teachers hated them, banning them from classrooms because the snapping noise was constant and distracting. Parents worried when cheap knockoffs caused scratches or cuts, but that did not stop kids from wanting more. Entire recesses were spent comparing patterns, zebra stripes, neon colors, or glittery designs. The sound of that metallic snap became part of the background noise of every cafeteria and playground. Looking back, it is funny how something so simple could create such chaos. They were banned in some schools, which only made them more popular, fueling the craze even further. Today, the fad feels like one of those moments where kids and adults lived in completely different worlds. One saw harmless fun, the other saw mayhem. In the end, silly slap bracelets were pure 1980s, colorful, loud, and destined to be remembered with both laughter and disbelief. Do you remember the pride of seeing your initials flash across the screen, proof you had conquered the machine? For kids in the 1980s, Saturday mornings were sacred. You woke up early, grabbed the remote, and poured yourself a mountain of sugary cereal, ready to spend hours glued to the screen. Cartoons like He-Man, Transformers, and Smurfs turned living rooms into kingdoms of color and chaos. The cereal was half the fun. Neon marshmallows, chocolate puffs, fruit-shaped loops. Every bite felt like dessert disguised as breakfast. Kids shoveled spoonfuls into their mouths, milk turning into a rainbow swamp at the bottom of the bowl. Commercials for toys and even more cereal filled the gaps, creating a feedback loop of sugar and marketing genius. Parents let it slide, happy for a few hours of peace. They knew the crash would come later, when kids bounced off walls and then collapsed in sugar comas. But in the moment, Saturday mornings were pure joy. Cartoons blaring, bowls clinking, and kids laughing with milk mustaches. Looking back, it feels absurd that sugar bombs passed as breakfast, but nobody cared. The combination of cartoons and cereal was unstoppable, a ritual that every 1980s kid remembers. You sat in a folding chair, you stared ahead, and then the photographer said, "Say cheese," while lasers exploded behind you. That is right. We are talking about laser backgrounds in school photos. For some reason, every kid in the 1980s decided the best way to capture the innocence of youth was to be immortalized against a backdrop that looked like a Star Trek rave. Bright blue and hot pink lasers crisscrossed behind you like you were dodging security beams in a heist movie. You could be wearing a Mickey Mouse sweatshirt, and the background would make you look like you were breaking into NASA. It was peak 1980s over-the-topness. Loud, flashy, and totally unnecessary. But somehow every kid wanted it. It was the photo choice that said, "I am ready for the future." And also recess. Parents either loved it or groaned at it. And looking back now, it is a nostalgic masterpiece of absurdity. Sure, it aged poorly, but there is something kind of wonderful about a generation that thought lasers made everything better. That includes the next wild invention too. Tiny wrist gadgets that promised futuristic fun but usually conked out before lunchtime. Rubik's Cubes sat on coffee tables like miniature monuments to frustration. Their colorful sides promised fun, but more often delivered rage. You twisted, you turned, you thought you had it, and then disaster. One wrong move sent you back to square one. Solving it became a badge of honor. If someone at school could actually complete a Rubik's Cube, they were treated like a genius. Crowds gathered, applause broke out, but most of us faked it. We peeled off the stickers and rearranged them to make it look solved, or we popped out the pieces and snapped them back into place. Technically cheating? Maybe. Spiritually rewarding? Absolutely. There were books, guides, even videos explaining how to beat the cube, but few had the patience. And yet, we all kept trying. Rubik's Cubes lived in junk drawers, backpacks, and classroom desks. They were part toy, part puzzle, part stress test. Looking back, they were frustrating, addictive, and completely iconic. And to this day, if you spot one on a shelf, your hands remember the rhythm of twist, turn, twist, even if your brain still has no idea how to actually solve it. Record players were more than machines. They were furniture, ritual, and mood setters all in one. In the 1960s, every home had one, whether it stood alone on a tabletop or was built into a cabinet the size of a small sofa. You lifted the lid, selected a vinyl record, and gently placed it on the turntable. Then came the careful lowering of the needle, a tiny, deliberate act that brought a whole room to life. The crackle before the music started was half the experience. Whether it was the Beatles, Patsy Cline, or the Four Tops, the sound filled the air in a way no radio could match. You listened to full albums, start to finish. You memorized the order of songs. You stared at the cover art like it held secrets. Records were delicate, and so was the act of playing them. Dust had to be brushed off. Needles had to be replaced. Some turntables had automatic arms, others had to be nudged by hand. Either way, it felt like ceremony. The music had weight, not just in sound, but in the effort it took to hear it. Families gathered for listening nights. Teenagers escaped into headphones. A stack of records leaning against the wall told you everything about someone. And even when the music skipped, it felt like part of the charm. That moment when the room fell still, waiting for the needle to find its groove again, it was quiet, real, and unforgettable. Today, vinyl has made a comeback, but for those who grew up spinning hits in the 1960s, it never really left. Pong was not just a video game, it was the crackling start of a digital age no one saw coming. In a darkened arcade or a wood-paneled basement, a small white square bounced between two rectangles, and it felt like the future had arrived. In the 1970s, Pong introduced children and adults alike to the very idea that machines could play back. It was slow, it was simple, but it was hypnotic. One button, one dial, endless tension. Could you angle it just right? Would you miss by a pixel? It was a battle of nerves and reflexes, disguised as a tennis match. It pulled people in, not with explosions, but with the thrill of control. Friends huddled around the console, taking turns, arguing over high scores. The beeps and boops became as familiar as laughter. Parents were skeptical. They thought it was a toy. But it was more than that. It was a shift. A quiet signal that entertainment was moving from the television to the interactive screen. Pong turned passivity into play. It made you active, involved, part of the story. And though games today are more complex, more realistic, more everything, none of them gave you the feeling Pong did, that this blinking pixel was somehow alive, that you were in the game. And for the first time ever, the screen played back. Nothing says 1980s like a teenager strutting down the street with a boombox balanced on their shoulder, blasting music for the whole block. Portable in name only, these stereos were massive, with giant speakers, cassette decks, and enough buttons to feel like piloting a spaceship. They ran on batteries, 8 to 12 of them, that drained faster than a flashlight at summer camp. Yet the boombox was a badge of pride. Kids lugged them to basketball courts, beaches, and schoolyards, setting the soundtrack for every hangout. Songs became public property, your mixtape blaring out for strangers and friends alike. Parents complained about the noise, but secretly marveled at the sheer audacity of turning a personal playlist into a community event. The shoulder carry itself was an art form. Too low and it slipped, too high and you looked awkward. The real pros strutted with confidence, head bobbing, volume at maximum. The music was not just background, it was identity, broadcast as loudly as the speakers allowed. Of course, the weight was ridiculous. After a few blocks, shoulders ached, backs tensed, and batteries sputtered. Still, nobody cared. For one shining decade, boomboxes turned sidewalks into stages and kids into DJs. Today, wireless earbuds keep music private, but back then, the louder the better. Do you remember hearing "Eye of the Tiger" or "Beat It" from half a mile away before spotting the kid carrying his stereo kingdom? If the lights went out in the 1980s, chances are something in your room lit up. Glow-in-the-dark stickers were slapped on every surface known to humankind. Bedroom ceilings became constellations. Alarm clocks glowed like miniature UFOs. Light switch covers, shoelaces, trapper keepers, even toothbrushes. Nothing was safe from the radioactive green charm of phosphorescent novelty. And as a kid, it was magic. You charged them up under a lamp, turned off the lights, and suddenly your room was a planetarium. Sort of. The glow would last about 30 seconds. And then, nothing. But those 30 seconds? Pure wonder. The problem came when the adhesive gave out and the stickers peeled off, leaving weird, dusty outlines on your walls. Or when the glow effect faded completely, leaving behind little blobs of dead plastic. Still, the trend exploded. Kids wanted to glow. Toys were made with it. T-shirts were printed with it. Some even tried to make glow-in-the-dark nail polish. The 80s loved the idea of visibility, especially in the dark. But while glowing stars were subtle, the next trend was anything but. Let us talk about the fashion moment that made teenagers look like they were headed straight for the football field. Shoulder pads, anyone? Desktop computer novelties were bulky, beige, and filled with possibilities. When a family brought home their first computer, it felt like inviting the future into the living room. The machine took up half the desk and made strange sounds when booting up, clicks, whirs, and beeps that signaled you were entering another world. Monitors were deep enough to qualify as furniture. The keyboard was loud, and the mouse had a rubber ball inside that collected lint like a magnet. Most people did not know what to do with them beyond opening word processors and playing games like Solitaire or Snake. But that was enough. You typed slowly, saving everything to floppy disks the size of your hand, praying they would not corrupt. The printer was louder than a lawnmower and took a full minute to spit out a single page. You bragged about your desktop like it was a new car. Friends came over just to look at it. You made banners with your name in pixelated fonts and felt like a genius. Desktop computers were clunky, confusing, and incredibly slow. But back then, they were windows into something bigger. And even when they froze, they still made you feel like the smartest house on the block. Tangy Taffy was the candy you had to work for, and that was half the fun. Long before it became part of the Laffy Taffy brand, this chewy strip came in a thin plastic wrapper and offered a sweet, stretchy challenge for any sugar-loving kid in the 1960s. It came in vibrant colors and punchy flavors like grape, strawberry, and sour apple, each one delivering a jolt of sugar and just the right amount of tartness. You could bend it, stretch it, or roll it into a ball before finally taking a bite. The longer you chewed, the stronger the flavor got, which made it perfect for kids trying to make a nickel's worth of candy last the whole afternoon. Sometimes it stuck to your teeth. Sometimes it stuck to the wrapper. But it was always worth it. Tangy Taffy was less about elegance and more about fun, bright, bold, and unapologetically sweet. For many kids, it was the ultimate playground treat, swapped on school buses or bought from corner stores with pocket change. Today's candies may be smoother or flashier, but they cannot match the simple satisfaction of a taffy you could stretch, fold, and chew until your jaw hurt. Fondue was not just melted cheese, it was an event. In the 1970s, hosting a fondue party was like throwing a dinner and a show at the same time. A pot of bubbling Gruyere sat in the middle of the table, and everyone dipped in, one long-stemmed fork at a time. Bread cubes, apples, vegetables, all danced in the cheese like characters in a social ballet. It was warm, it was slow, it forced conversation, and it felt deliciously European. Fondue was about togetherness. You could not rush it. Everyone shared the same pot, the same space, the same pace. In a decade obsessed with convenience, this was rebellion through ritual. Even the cleanup was part of the charm. For kids, fondue night felt fancy. For adults, it was the kind of leisure that said, "We have time, we have taste." Chocolate versions followed cheese. And suddenly, dessert became communal too. Marshmallows, strawberries, bananas, sweet-dipped memories on skewers. There was laughter, there was spilled wine, there was connection. Today, we microwave meals and eat alone on couches. But fondue was the opposite of that. It was interactive, intimate, and indulgent. And when the party ended, you felt full in more ways than one. Sticker collections were an obsession in the 1980s, but Scratch and Sniff took it to another level. Kids hoarded them in binders, trading them like baseball cards, showing them off during recess with the seriousness of jewel appraisers. The scents ranged from delightful, pizza, bubblegum, strawberries, to bizarre, gasoline, skunk, even dirt. Scratching the sticker released a puff of artificial aroma that somehow felt magical. Kids pressed noses to paper, giggling at the smells, daring each other to sniff the gross ones. The weirdest stickers often became the most prized, proof you had something rare and outrageous in your collection. Parents shook their heads at the nonsense, but for kids, it was serious business. A thick binder of Scratch and Sniff stickers meant status, bragging rights, and endless entertainment. Some even claimed sniffing them made homework less boring, though teachers disagreed. Of course, the scents faded over time, leaving just sticky patches of paper. But the memory of scratching, sniffing, and laughing remains. Today, Scratch and Sniff survives in novelty form, but in the 1980s, it was king of the playground. Do you remember opening your binder and proudly declaring, "This one smells like pizza," to an awed audience? There was a time when men's fashion turned into a pastel explosion. Inspired by Miami Vice, pastel blazers became the go-to power move for any guy who wanted to look cool, sophisticated, and vaguely like he sold luxury boats. The look was unmistakable. Shoulder-padded jackets in baby blue, mint green, or pale pink, paired with white pants and an attitude. You rolled up the sleeves. You wore it over a t-shirt. Bonus points if you wore loafers with no socks. It was supposed to say, "Confident Renegade." More often, it said, "Confused Ice Cream Vendor." It was television fantasy brought into everyday wardrobes, and it did not always survive the transition. Most men were not undercover detectives in Miami. They were accountants in Michigan. The style clashed with the office cubicles and suburban backyards where it showed up. And once the show faded from prime time, so did the look. The pastel blazer became fashion's forgotten relic. But if you thought that was an eyesore, wait until you see the avalanche of snot, slime, and absurdity that came from the most chaotic merchandise blitz of the 1980s. Garbage Pail Kids were just getting started. Mixtapes were handwritten love letters wrapped in cassette cases. You waited by the radio for hours just to hit record at the perfect moment, trying to catch the start of your favorite song without the DJ talking over it. You rewound, replayed, and carefully curated the perfect order so each track melted into the next. Some were made for crushes, others for best friends. Some were sorry tapes, and some were just because. Each one had a theme, a purpose, and a heart behind it. You picked songs that said what you could not. Then you labeled the tape in your best handwriting, maybe decorated the case, and handed it over like it was treasure. Because it was. A great mixtape took hours, sometimes days, to get just right. And when someone gave you one, you listened to it until the tape wore thin and the sound warped. Mixtapes were not just music. They were memories, feelings, time capsules wrapped in magnetic ribbon. And long after the songs faded, you remembered the person who made it, their handwriting, their choices, their message. Even now, in a world of playlists, nothing hits quite like the soft click of a tape deck and a song you once recorded just for someone else. Twister was the game that got people off the couch and tangled in each other's limbs. Released in 1966, it came with a plastic mat covered in colored circles and a spinner that decided your next move. Left hand red, right foot green. Before you knew it, you were stretching across the mat in a precarious pose, face pressed against someone's knee, hoping no one slipped. It was silly, physical, and weirdly intimate. Some parents called it indecent. Some schools banned it. But kids loved it. So did teenagers. It broke the ice at parties, sparked laughter between siblings, and gave families something active to do together. It was as much about falling over as it was about winning. The rustle of the mat, the sound of giggles as someone toppled, the concentration in trying to stay upright, it was all part of the fun. Twister took no prep and delivered instant chaos. It did not care about strategy. It cared about balance, luck, and how far you could stretch without collapsing. And for many, it was the first time a game made you move, laugh, and fall down all in one messy, unforgettable moment. There was something sacred about Saturday mornings in the 1970s. Before the sun had a chance to fully warm the sidewalks, children would gather around boxy television sets, cereal bowls in hand, as the glow of cartoons lit up the room. There were no on-demand options, no rewinds, just that fleeting window where animated worlds came alive. Shows like Scooby-Doo, The Jetsons, and Fat Albert and the Cosby Kids became more than entertainment. They were rituals as ingrained in childhood as scraped knees and secret treehouse meetings. Those opening theme songs became the soundtrack of a generation, each one latching onto memory like the scent of crayon wax or the feeling of Velcro shoes. Parents knew this time was sacred too. It was the one morning a week when the kids were quiet, transfixed, and content. The living room became a miniature theater, complete with the scent of toast and the sound of muffled laughter. Today, we scroll endlessly for something to watch, barely paying attention to what plays next. But back then, if you missed it, you missed it. That was part of the magic. Each cartoon was a one-time event, and those who were there remember. It was the childhood version of an appointment, circled not on a calendar, but etched into the rhythm of every kid's week. And when the final show ended, it felt like something wonderful had passed, just like the decade that gave it to us. Step into any mall in the 1980s, and you were guaranteed to hear the electronic symphony of the arcade. Pac-Man gobbling pellets, Galaga blasting aliens, pinballs clattering against bumpers. The air buzzed with neon lights and endless noise. Kids showed up with buckets of quarters, ready to wage war against machines that ate allowance money as fast as they ate ghosts. Arcade marathons were not just games. They were battles of endurance. Thumbs blistered, backs hunched, and eyes glazed as kids played for hours, determined to get their initials on the high-score screen. Crowds gathered to cheer, offering tips or jeering when someone lost a life. Parents groaned at the money vanishing into slots, but for kids, it was worth every coin. The arcade was freedom, competition, and comedy rolled into one. Friends argued over who was best, rivalries formed, and every victory carried the weight of a championship. Of course, the machines were merciless. A single mistake and your quarter was gone, swallowed forever. Still, kids came back, convinced that this time they would make it further, faster, higher. Today, arcades have mostly faded, but the memory of clinking coins and glowing screens lives on. You knew it was going to be a good school year when your pencil case smelled like a fruit salad. Rubber-scented erasers shaped like food were the peak of academic excitement in the 1980s. They looked like tiny hamburgers, donuts, pickles, even sushi rolls. If you were lucky, your set came with a tiny tray and a fake soda. They were bright, colorful, and smelled like someone spilled a bottle of air freshener in an art supply store. Only problem? They did not actually erase anything. If anything, they left behind more streaks than they removed. Still, no one really used them. You displayed them, you traded them, you clutched them like they were gold. And every now and then, someone tried to eat one just to see what would happen. It was childhood logic at its finest. If it smells like a strawberry milkshake, it must taste like one too, right? Wrong. But what these erasers lacked in function, they made up for in flair. They were tiny scented trophies of your youth. And while they never helped you pass math, they sure looked good on your desk. Speaking of things that looked great on the surface but did not last, let us hit play on a sound that defined a decade and then disappeared overnight. The synthesizer, the drum machine, the shoulder pads. Go-go boots made feet loud. White, shiny, and knee-high, they were the footwear of a generation that danced like the future was already here. First hitting the scene in the mid-1960s, these boots were inspired by the go-go dancers in clubs and discotheques, but they quickly spilled onto sidewalks, into schoolyards, and onto TV screens. You saw them on mod fashion icons, music variety shows, and girls in miniskirts taking confident steps through department stores. The silhouette was sleek, often with a low heel or flat sole, and the material was usually faux leather or vinyl. They zipped up the side and hugged the calf like they were ready to march straight into next week. Girls loved them, boys noticed them, parents did not always understand them. But go-go boots were about movement, rhythm, and control. They were made for dancing in cages or down aisles, for stomping to a new beat. They were tough, stylish, and a little space-age. They turned any outfit into a statement, something louder, shinier, braver. Some came in colors like pink or silver, others stuck to the classic white, but all of them turned heads. They were worn to school, to clubs, to sock hops, and even to job interviews. Wearing go-go boots meant you were not just in fashion, you were ahead of it. And for those who wore them, they were not just shoes. They were power, they were movement. They were the sound of confidence, echoing down a hallway of change. The Rubik's Cube stormed into the 1980s like a colorful hurricane. This little plastic puzzle promised endless entertainment. Just twist, turn, and match the colors. Simple in theory, maddening in practice. Millions bought them, and millions gave up after a week. Coffee tables across America became graveyards for half-solved cubes. Kids tried, parents tried, even grandparents tried, only to stare in frustration at a stubborn square that refused to align. Some cheated by peeling off stickers, others by forcing the cube apart and snapping it back together. The satisfaction was short-lived, but the bragging rights lasted forever. Schools saw Rubik's Cubes pop up in hallways, with kids racing against timers or showing off their two sides solved, like it was an Olympic medal. Competitions sprang up, and soon speed cubers turned the fad into a skill. But for most, the cube was destined to gather dust. The bright side? Even unsolved, the Rubik's Cube became decor, a permanent fixture on shelves, signaling you had at least attempted greatness. Today, speed cubing is serious business, but back then, the craze was about comedy as much as competition. Do you remember twisting furiously, convinced that if you tried just one more move, the cube would finally surrender? Before cell phones, there were landlines. And before minimalism, there were designer phone covers. And boy, did the 1980s go all in. You could not just have a phone, you had to dress it. We are talking fur-lined receivers, leopard print handsets, and rhinestone-covered cradles. Nothing screamed glamour, like trying to have a conversation with what looked like a bedazzled chinchilla pressed against your ear. There was even one that looked like a hamburger. Why? No one really knows. But the 1980s were not about asking why. They were about asking, does this come in glitter pink? People wanted their rotary phones to match their shag carpet and floral wallpaper, and these accessories delivered poorly. The covers fell apart. They muffled the sound. And let us be honest, no emergency call was improved by digging through a layer of sequins. It turned something simple into a full-time job. You had to prepare to use your phone. The trend eventually fizzled out, mostly because the novelty wore off and the practicality never existed in the first place. Still, the 1980s loved their flair, especially when you could wear it, like, say, around your neck in the most jingly way possible. Atari gaming sessions were pixelated magic. You plugged in a cartridge, gripped a joystick, and entered a world made of blinking squares and bleeping sounds. The graphics were basic, the controls were stiff, and yet you were hooked. Pong, Frogger, Space Invaders. Each game was a challenge, a test of reflexes and patience. You played alone, with friends, or against your sibling for hours. The television hummed, the screen flickered, the joystick squeaked under the weight of your determination. Games froze, scores reset, but the fun never stopped. Atari brought the arcade home, turning dens and basements into battlegrounds of bragging rights. There were no saves, no checkpoints, just you and your ability to last longer than your last game. Every win felt epic, every loss felt personal. And if the cartridge did not load, you took it out, blew into it like a sacred ritual, and tried again. Atari gaming was simple, frustrating, and unforgettable. It was not about the graphics, it was about the experience. And for those who held that joystick and battled blinking enemies, those early games are etched in memory. Proof that sometimes a bouncing square was all it took to feel like a hero. So which of these funny things from the 1980s would shock you the most today? Share your pick in the comments. Tap like if it made you laugh and subscribe so we can keep reliving the wildest parts of the past together.